Throughout the world today, people find themselves in undignified and unjust working conditions. The worst excesses of hyper-exploitative and dangerous work, once widespread here in the global north, have been exported to the global south. Current levels of consumption and fast fashion are only possible because people in other parts of the world have been systematically exploited. Even here in the UK, widespread problems of ill health and poor conditions associated with work remain, and many people still find themselves in precarious, poorly paid employment on 0 hours contracts and in undignified and sometimes even dangerous conditions. Across the world, in more and less extreme ways, consumption for profit has been privileged over people. This only encourages unjust working practices. But there is nothing which makes this situation necessary. Catholic social teaching tries to look beyond the current status quo, which sees the utility of the worker as the most important factor. Instead, Catholic teaching prioritises the full dignity of the human person, which is always more than their function as a worker. Accordingly, work should not be seen as the ultimate value of human life. Instead, it should be seen as an outlet in which people can grow and flourish whilst contributing to the common good. Building on the principles of the human economy outlined in the last video, we can summarise Catholic social teaching on work in 4 key ideas. Firstly, the needs of labour, the people doing the work, should always be prioritised over capital. In other words, the factory and its machinery and the financial assets of a business or an individual. Secondly, work should always be dignified. People should receive, as a minimum, a living wage on which they can live well and contribute to a family. The workplace should be a safe and secure place, somewhere where individuals and their families are able to flourish whilst having a meaningful stake in the work that they do. Thirdly, when thinking about work and working conditions, we should always apply the principle of the preferential option for the poor. That is, we should always place the perspective of the lowest paid members of the workforce at the forefront of thinking or decision-making in relation to work. In many cases, those who work in the worst conditions are also the poorest. Fourthly, Catholic social teaching allows and encourages workers to join trade unions. As we will see, unions are an important practical means through which the needs and dignity of workers can be secured. Concern for people's living and working conditions, particularly the poorest, stretches back to the beginning of the Dominican tradition, with St. Dominic himself. Whilst Dominic was studying in Spain, famine ravaged the country, and seeing the destitution of the conditions that the poor were left in, Dominic sold the books which were indispensable for his studies and distributed the income that was made from the sales to the poor of the city. When someone challenged this act, Dominic is said to have responded, "Would you have me study off these dead skins when men are dying of hunger?" Dominic's awareness of the conditions of the poorest, as well as his effort to change these conditions, has gone on to inspire the lives of many members of the Dominican order throughout history, in all parts of the globe. Father Vincent McNabb is one example of this. Born in Ireland in 1868, Vincent lived in Britain for the majority of his life as a Dominican friar. Communicating and spreading the faith was a central part of his ministry. Vincent was an extremely talented preacher and expositor of Catholic thought, and he gained an influential audience. As part of his preaching, he argued that social justice was as natural as prayer. This was particularly relevant in Britain in the early 20th century, when Vincent was most active. People in urban, industrialised Britain were often poorly paid and forced to work long hours in cruel and dehumanising conditions. Moved with compassion by this situation, Vincent emphasised the need to change the conditions. Following Pope Leo XIII, he called this challenge the pressing question of the hour. Through his newspaper columns, Vincent argued that safer working conditions, decent housing, and the right to a living wage were all necessities. As early as 1912, for example, in the context of a miners' strike where wages were being cut because of the falling profits of the company, Vincent argues that the miners were entitled to a living family wage. This labourer's living wage, he argued, should be a priority of industry. As well as arguing the need for change, Vincent invited his readers to see the effects of these working conditions through the eyes of the poor. He describes the appalling slum housing conditions in great detail. He poses questions of his readers, asking, "How should I like to live on 5 3/4 a day?" which is equivalent to £1.45 today. "How could I love God above all things and my neighbour as myself on 3.5 a day?" equivalent to 80 today. Whilst the principle of the preferential option for the poor would only become fully articulated during the second half of the 20th century, Vincent could be said to be an early proponent of it. By presenting the perspective of the poor in every aspect of his writings, Vincent showed how this perspective should guide our decision-making, including on the question of working conditions. It was this relentless focus which led Vincent to be described as the champion of the poor upon his death in 1943. Another champion of the poor who fought tirelessly for improved working conditions in a very different context is Sister Elizabeth Voisin. Born in France in 1921, Elizabeth entered a congregation of Dominican sisters in 1940. From the very beginning, she was concerned about the everyday injustices that played out in the living and working conditions of many people. Not only this, but she was insistent that there should be no difference between her life as a sister and the lives of the poor who she called to serve. After a number of years, Elizabeth was posted to a small community of 2 sisters in the south of France, where she was able to find work in an industrial laundrette, predominantly working alongside Yugoslavian and African migrants. There, for the first time, she described the indignity of the humiliating workplace in which you could never work fast enough. Workers were expected to work all day and only had one 20-minute lunch break, despite working in suffocating heat. Orders were handed out without explanation. When this first company closed, Elizabeth was encouraged by her colleagues to join a much larger company, infamous for its tough methods. The colleagues recognised that there were people here who Elizabeth could serve. In the larger company, the workers were forbidden to talk or go to the toilet and even subjected to physical violence. Labour laws were persistently flouted. In total, Elizabeth worked for 14 years in this environment. She went in with the simple aim of living in solidarity with the people working in these conditions by serving them and fully immersing herself in their experience. Eventually, however, Elizabeth recognised that she could no longer stay silent in the face of continued injustice. She convinced her often resigned colleagues that change was possible and established a union branch within the company. One of their early successes was the removal of toxic acid from the part of the factory where they worked. Following this, Elizabeth was elected as the overall union representative for the factory. Despite receiving anonymous death threats, she persisted in informing the workers in the different parts of the factory of their rights and the collective labour agreement which they were part of. Many did not even know that such rights existed. Finally, in what was the union's greatest success, in 1982, they initiated a court action and won against the company who had paid below the minimum wage for an entire year. As a result of this success, every worker received the money that they were due. As of 2024, Elizabeth, now in her old age, lives with another sister in a housing project and provides fraternal support, visiting the sick in hospital. Finally, in another context, Gustavo Gutierrez, a Dominican theologian from Peru, was a key figure in the popularization of the idea of the preferential option for the poor. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Gustavo and other South American theologians developed the idea of liberation theology. This theology arose out of the thought that European theologians had failed to accurately reflect the reality of the terrible and widespread working and living conditions in South America. Gustavo and others developed the idea of liberation theology as an alternative that would prioritize social concern for the poor and political liberation for oppressed peoples. Although this theology had been seen as controversial because of its overtly political approach, it has unquestionably inspired many great acts of social justice. Here is Sister Margaret Mace speaking about its influence on her life when working with poor communities in the Dominican Republic.
We were believed and we were somewhat schooled in liberation theology. And we believed that people couldn't be free if they weren't aware of their rights, if they weren't educated to some extent, and if they weren't included in decision-making. So that colored everything that we did.
Throughout this video, then, we have seen that Dominicans like Vincent, Elizabeth, and Gustavo have all emphasized the importance of the perspective of the poor in different ways. In collaboration with others, they have brought attention to unjust employment practices and changed people's working conditions for the better. There are a few simple ways in which you can carry the spirit of this tradition on in your own life. Firstly, you could make a habit of thinking about where the objects you purchase and consume are made. Consider how the item has arrived in your hands. Stop to reflect on the hours of effort put into the work. What relationships, infrastructures, and entanglements sit behind the objects that make up our daily lives? Secondly, you could try to prioritise using companies and organisations which pay the living wage and uphold good working conditions. And you can find more information about the campaign for the living wage and a list of some living wage employers at www.livingwage.org.uk. Thirdly, if you're already in work or when you work in the future, you could consider joining a union. Unions, as we have seen, have an important place in the Catholic tradition and help to secure the dignity and rights of workers. In closing, Gustavo Gutierrez once wrote that the elimination of misery and exploitation is a sign of the coming of the kingdom. Through their life's work, the different Dominicans we have explored in this video all anticipate something of the glory and justice of heaven on earth. By actively prioritising the needs and dignity of workers and recognising the value of their work, we too can be a sign of the coming of God's kingdom.